welcome to the first of hopefully many MyData-TRUST masterclasses connecting data protection and life sciences. So we only have 20 minutes for the actual presentation and then 10 minutes for Q&A. So I'm going to go quite quickly through some of these topics. It is not designed to be a GDPR training session. It's more looking at key points, key things to look out for if you're working in the life sciences space as it relates to data protection. So who am I? Why should you listen to me? What do I have to add here? So I'm currently Chief Development Officer at MyData-TRUST, and I'm also head of MyData-TRUST UK. Outside of those roles, I am an experienced certified data protection officer, have been for almost 5 years now. My background is not within the legal space, so many of the data protection officers you'll come across will have legal backgrounds. I don't. My experience is in clinical research, so I've always been in the life science space for almost 20 years now, working within sites, CROs, in different roles, different functions. So I understand how clinical trials work, I understand the terminology, and the move for me has been more to how do we apply data protection to what we do in clinical research. So let's start with what is the GDPR. It is a harmonized regulation for the EU, actually the EEA. Obviously the UK being outside of the EU at this point. I'm going to keep referring to GDPR and including the UK in this discussion, in these topics, because essentially for the time being, it's the same thing. There are minor changes here and there, which I will call out as we go through this presentation. But as things currently stand, with the changes in government and different things happening in the UK, we're essentially following the same legislation. So there's been attempts to put data protection in place across Europe for quite a while now. The previous attempt being the Data Protection Directive. The challenge with the directive is that it doesn't automatically apply across all EU member states. It is interpreted, it is written into different national laws. Whereas with the regulation, this now applies across all EU member states. It is a very good attempt at harmonization. It is not perfect. And as we go through this presentation, even at this very high level, just looking at key points, you'll see there are some differences in interpretation between EU member states. But it is a strong step forward. It is a good improvement in terms of considering digital data and not just hard copy paper-based data. And it does introduce new themes, so there are tougher fines for non-compliance. It does grant more rights for people that are in the EU or the UK. It does have a slight change in its approach. So with the directive, it was very much on the individual to recognize or find out if their data was processed illegally and then complain about it. Whereas the GDPR puts much more emphasis on the company or entity doing the processing, so the controller, and we'll discuss these terms in a moment, but it puts more emphasis on the controller to think ahead of time about the data they're processing and how they should best protect it to align with GDPR. Okay, as I said, it's not a training session, so I won't go through all of these in detail, but I wanted to highlight the principles of GDPR, and those are on the screen at the moment. We've split them into 7. In GDPR, it's described as 6, but this gives you a good feeling for what's included. Many of these terms, as life science professionals, you should be familiar with. There shouldn't be a lot of surprises here, actually. So things like making sure that we're being fair and transparent, we're informing data subjects about what's happening. It's very similar to what we have to do for patients for a clinical trial. Making sure we're clear on the purpose of the processing, making sure data is accurate, security and confidentiality. These are all things we do in clinical research in life sciences already. So the GDPR isn't miles away from what we already do. It does impose some slightly different approaches, different documentation, different ways of documenting and approaching the data processing, but nothing that's really out there. In terms of storage limitation, GDPR does not impose a duration that you may process data for or store data for, but obviously we have other laws that clinical trials and life science companies abide by that do impose those storage limitations. So for example, the EU CTR typically will have 25 years that we must store the data for. So GDPR will align with the EU CTR in that situation. We must store the data for 25 years by law, but at the end of that storage period, we should delete or anonymize that data. So having described what GDPR is, who does it apply to? So again, I'm referring to the EU here, but I am including the UK. So if you're a processor or controller in the EU or the UK, it should stand to reason that you're going to be subject to EU and UK laws, depending which one of those you're in. And that means the GDPR. So if you're in the EU and you're processing personal data, irrespective of where you're processing it, you will need to abide by the GDPR. What about in a situation where you're not in the EU or UK? In that case, there's a number of targeting factors we need to consider to determine if GDPR applies to you or not. So either you have data subjects in the EU or the UK, and you're offering goods or services to those data subjects, and or you're monitoring their behavior. So under European Data Protection Board guidance, clinical trials are seen as monitoring of behavior. And so often if you're, say, a US-based processor or controller conducting a study in Europe, because your data subjects are in Europe and you're monitoring behavior, you will be subject to the GDPR. It will still apply even though you're not based in one of these regions. So what is personal data? And it's I've added this, even though this isn't a training session, I'm adding this to the conversation because there is a vast difference in the interpretation of personal data, depending which region, which law you're looking at. So under the EU or UK GDPR, essentially anything that relates to an individual, any information that is identifiable or identifies an individual is personal data. And you can see some examples on the screen. It has to be related to a natural person, so not a legal person, not a company, an entity. It cannot relate to an animal, and the person has to be alive. Even in that definition, there are certain member states that have decided actually some of these rules, if not all of these rules, may continue after death. So France and Spain being good examples here, where there are rights that can be implemented that still apply after death. So when you're conducting a clinical trial, if you're conducting a trial in France, for example, and someone dies during your study, their data may still be protected, even though they have died at that point. And it has to be identified or identifiable. So I introduced myself at the beginning. You saw my photo on the screen, although admittedly I look slightly different now. You can see my image on the camera speaking to you at the moment. I'm clearly identified. There are other ways of identifying people, even without knowing who they are immediately. We've got some examples on the left-hand side, so fingerprints, Albert Einstein, even a number plate. So this is the Belgian number plate, but it applies elsewhere as well. So for example, in the UK, if I can get access to the DVLA database, I can identify an individual based on their number plate. So it's identifiable means directly or indirectly by using other information by any means reasonably likely to be used. And not all data are protected the same way. So there are special categories of data which require extra protections. There's also criminal data and obviously data related to children. So do bear some of these in mind if you're conducting clinical trials. If you're doing debarment checks, fraud checks, you potentially identify criminal data. Obviously, you're really hoping you don't, but it is something that could happen. If you're conducting studies in children, pediatric studies, adolescent studies, you potentially cross into the children's data category and need to add additional protections there. But for sure, if you're conducting clinical research, working in life sciences, you're definitely processing some of the special categories of data. You can see the list on the screen, and a lot of these you can tick off, even down to sex life or sexual orientation. If you're processing pregnant partner data, for example, it gives a good indication of some of those factors. I've referenced these already, but there are a number of roles to be aware of under GDPR. So we have the data subject, who I've mentioned a few times. That's the person whose data it is or who it relates to. We have the controller, which is the entity that decides about the data processing, who's involved in it, why you're processing that data, how are you processing that data, all the factors that underline why the processing is occurring, so the means and the methods. And then we also have processors. So these are entities that act on behalf or under the instruction of the controller. So for example, for life sciences, clinical research, we're looking at a sponsor being the controller because they write the protocol. They say what data is being collected, why it's being collected, what the aims are. And then you have, say, a CRO as your processor. They're conducting the study, but only under the instruction of the sponsor, the controller. It'd be really nice if everyone stuck to these very simple terms, but unfortunately we don't have that situation, and different member states take different factors into consideration. So if we consider here the example of the relationship between a sponsor and between a site, the European Data Protection Board guidance is that it should be a controller-processor relationship. So that's what you see in the UK, in France, in many other member states. In some countries, some member states, they have decided it's a joint controller relationship. So the site and the sponsor both have responsibilities as controllers for this processing activity. This is in countries such as Germany, Netherlands, Austria. And then you also have independent controllers. So this often happens in Italy, for example, where there's a split of responsibilities. The site is responsible for the patient's ongoing medical care and processing of that data, and the sponsor is responsible for the processing of the clinical trial data. If that wasn't complicated enough, you then have to consider countries like Spain, where there are regional differences as to the site and sponsor relationship. And even within regions, you can come across differences of opinion at the site level. So Spain is slightly more challenging in terms of understanding what the roles are. Often it's best to have that discussion with the site, understand how they see their role, and make sure that both parties put in place the necessary requirements. So this brings us on to a legal basis. So under GDPR, when we looked at the principles right back at the beginning, the first one was the lawfulness of processing. And GDPR does describe 6 legal bases which can be used for processing data. It stands to reason if one of these legal bases does not apply to your processing is not legal because you cannot find a legal basis for it. So we also have to make sure that we have an appropriate legal basis for the processing we're doing. For clinical research, the European Data Protection Board, again, has given guidance that this should be legitimate interest. So it's the legitimate interest of the sponsor to conduct the research, to show that the compound, the device, whatever it might be, is safe, show it has a benefit to a certain indication or for the wider public, to enable that processing to occur. Most of you will be more familiar with consent as a legal basis. And actually, in a lot of situations, consent isn't the most appropriate legal basis for a trial. I won't go into details except to say consent has to be freely given, and that's not always the case for clinical research. So mainly we focus on legitimate interests, legal obligations, and contractual obligations when we're looking at research and life sciences. Consent can be used sometimes, and certain countries, certain member states will insist that consent is used for the data processing. So some examples being Germany, again, Netherlands, Austria, as we mentioned, for joint controllers, they also look at consent. But most EU member states and the UK will look at legitimate interests for the processing of personal data. So this is an example from France, just to try and give a breakdown of different legal bases that you may use. So the legal bases we've just talked through are the light blue ones on the left-hand side of the screen. The dark blue ones on the right-hand side relate to the legal basis for processing sensitive personal data. So you can see for clinical research, it's not as simple as just choosing one legal basis. We have to be able to combine both the legal basis for processing all data and the legal basis for processing sensitive data. And these have to be in place. We have to document these, we have to know what they are before we start the research, And it's really important to know the roles and the legal bases that are relied upon for your research, because this affects a number of your documents, CTAs, ICFs, the rights of the data subjects. They all hinge on these couple of decisions that you're going to need to make early on. So I mentioned rights of data subjects there. You can see them on the screen at the moment. Let me start, because I know we've got a number of life science people on the session. Let me start by saying these are not absolute. They don't all apply in all circumstances all the time. So you do need to understand, as I mentioned, what your legal basis is, and then you can communicate to your data subjects what their rights are. There are caveats in the GDPR for scientific research, so where some rights will not apply or may be limited. It might be that they do apply, you won't have immediate access to them. So for example, a right of access, if it's a double-blind placebo-controlled study, you're not going to give access during the study because you potentially unblind people. But it may be that you give them access to the data at the end of the study once the CSR has been written. So they may be limited, or they may not apply at all. Honestly, the best way to handle data subject rights is make sure you describe them correctly up front so they know what they are. And whenever a request for a data subject right comes through, involve your DPO. They can assess on a case-by-case basis and make sure you make the right decision as to which ones apply, when they apply, and how to manage the situation. A quick note on the timelines for data subject inquiries. So when you receive the original request, you have to reply within 1 month, 30 calendar days, back to the data subject. This can be extended by a further 2 months, but you still have to reply to the data subject within 1 month to explain to them why it's being extended. So they have to have a response from you. Records of data processing activities. So these are mandatory under GDPR. These are a set of records that capture all of the data processing activities that you're performing, and we have to capture them by process. So we typically see clinical research processing of patient data as a single process. Other examples are on the screen here as well. So what is very easy, it's a big trap to fall into, but it's to only think about your clinical trials. Get all of the clinical trial information set up, do everything right in terms of data protection for the trial for patient data, and then forget about all of the other activities you're performing, which include processing of personal data. So you really need to assess across the company where you're processing personal data, why, and then build these records to document all of that information. And don't forget, and I'll come back to this, but don't forget that patients are not the only data subjects in clinical research. Other mandatory requirements under GDPR, perform a data protection impact assessment, or DPIA. So these are risk assessments for a high risk data processing activity. Typically, if not almost always, your clinical trial will be a high risk data processing activity. And this is because it's usually a large volume of data, it's sensitive data. Consider even in a phase 1, maybe you've got 10 patients, but due to the number of data points, you're collecting a huge amount of data about each individual. So it's still going to potentially need a DPIA and be a high risk processing. So when you do your DPIA, your data protection impact assessment, it's a risk analysis of that study or of that processing activity. That means considering all vendors, all security measures that are in place, where there's potential risks, what the risk is if someone actually accesses the data, what's the risk to the data subject. It's less about what's the risk to your company, and it's more about what's the risk to the data subject. Everything we do is to protect the data of data subjects, and we have to try very hard not to forget that. We have to do what's right for the individual. So we look at every aspect of the study, in this case, the study that we can, and we look at where there's gaps, where there's threats, how can we correct or mitigate against these items to really lower that risk. We want to bring that risk down from a high risk processing activity to hopefully a low risk processing activity, or at least minimize it as far as humanly possible. Okay, and I'm not going to go into all of these, but just to draw your attention to security is critical. There's no point having all of your personal data stored in a certain folder structure with really good security if everyone uses the same login details and anyone can access it, and it's a simple password that anyone could hack. You really need to put thought into what's an appropriate security measure for the type of data you're processing, but also the type of organization you are. What are you processing? What would be the risk if someone accessed that? And so we've got some examples on the screen here. It's not just technical measures. Again, another big trap people fall into is implementing technical IT-related security measures. Actually, most of the breaches I have to deal with are due to organizational issues, lack of training, or just human error. And that's outside the realm of IT security. So you need to consider what you can put in place at an organizational or physical level that also supports security of your data. Okay, and a quick word on transfers, and there is a slight difference between UK and EU here when we get into the details, but at the top level, they're very similar. Transfers within the EEA are allowed. That's a free flow of data. Every member state is working to the same GDPR requirements, so therefore it's considered equivalent level of protection across the board. Transfers outside of the EEA, and this includes to the UK, are considered restricted transfers. They're not protected under GDPR, and so additional measures are needed to enable that transfer and ensure, again, the data is protected and the data subject is protected. So a quick overview of these. There's essentially a three-tiered approach to how you can protect data transfers. The first tier is an adequacy decision. So if the EU has determined that a third country has essentially an equivalent level of data protection to the EU, then you can transfer the data without additional measures being needed. You would still have to inform your data subject that the data is crossing that border, where it's going, and the fact that there is an adequacy decision, but at least you don't need to take additional steps. The second tier to protect transfers, sorry, I should note for the adequacy decision, actually EU and UK recognise each other as things currently stand as having adequate data protection in place. So free flow of data between the EU and UK. This could change in future, but that's where we are right now. In terms of appropriate safeguards, so the second tier of protecting data transfers, there's a number of safeguards you can use here. What we typically see for clinical trials, because of the short timelines, is most often the European Standard Contractual Clauses, or SCCs. This is a set of 4 modules, non-negotiable, non-editable clauses that both parties have to sign up to and comply with. So it's not just sufficient to put them in place, sign them off and say we're done. You actually have to comply with them, and that may include a transfer impact assessment, which I won't go into detail here, but it is an assessment to make sure that there is appropriate protection for the data. Note the UK being outside of the EU doesn't use the SCCs. The UK uses the UK International Data Transfer Agreement, or IDTA, but essentially it's a similar principle. It's a set of clauses you have to implement and comply with. And then the third tier is specific derogations. Honestly, I don't use them unless it's very much a last resort for me. Derogations are for small scale one-off processing and really isn't appropriate for clinical research where there's constant transfers and a large volume of data in 90% of the cases. So I avoid them personally. I know other people like to use them, but for me, if you can put in an appropriate safeguard, you're compliant with GDPR, your safeguard is compliant with GDPR, I cannot think of a reason why you wouldn't do that. If one of the parties cannot comply with that safeguard, that then raises questions for me whether you're GDPR compliant in the first place. If none of these 3 options, and as I said, there's groups under each of these options, but if none of these 3 top level options work, then the transfer shouldn't occur. And I know I'm running short of time actually, so a quick note on data breach. I pulled this information a few months ago, so it may be slightly out of date now, but it gives you an idea of the scale of the fines. At the moment, the top 5 have targeted, in fact, the top 6 off the top of my head, have targeted big tech companies, but they won't always be looking at big tech. They will shift focus at some point in the future and look at other industries. The healthcare sector is responsible for over a third of worldwide breaches. So at some point, they are going to look at our sector and start issuing fines for breaches and other non-compliance issues. If you receive a data breach, it's really important your team recognizes it really quickly and that they send it through to the DPO, because if it's reportable to the data protection authorities, you only have 72 hours to do that reporting. If it comes in on a Friday evening at 5:30, that clock starts Friday evening at 5:30. You've got 72 hours from that point. So it's really important they get that information to you immediately so you can address it. So key takeaways, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. Key takeaways for the life sciences in no particular order. Determine your roles and determine your legal basis, because these have a knock-on effect on a number of these other items. If you haven't set these up, it's going to make it much more difficult to set up the rest of these areas. Protect your data transfers. Review if transfers are happening, and the best way that you can protect those, as I said, it's normally EU SECs or the UK IDTA, but you do have other measures you can look at as well. Establish your processes. So data breach and data subject request, I called those out for you guys because they have timelines associated with them, and it's critical that your team recognize what a breach is, what a data subject request is, and sends it through to you so you can actually action it within those timelines. Ensuring the correct language for contracts and privacy notices, again, relates back to knowing the roles and legal bases. So that will affect what language you put in these documents. Creating and maintaining your records of processing activities, the full set of records of what processing you actually do, and performing your DPIA for any high-risk processing. If it's a clinical trial, it's going to be a high-risk processing in the majority of cases. Get the DPIA in place. You make sure you're protecting yourselves, but more importantly, you make sure you're protecting the data and the data subject. So apologies, I whizzed through the end there, but hopefully you got those takeaways. That's sort of the key message. We do intend to run more of these masterclasses where we can dive in a little bit more detail in specific topics, but as our first one, we wanted to give a high-level overview. Thank you very much for your time. I think we do have some time available just to answer a few questions at this point. So please feel free to send them through on the chat, and I'll try and answer any that come through in the next minute or so. Okay, one question just come through. I think maybe there's a lag between me talking and you guys hearing me, but one question related to courses and e-learning. We have a number of different ways of offering training for the life science industry. Of course, we can do remote training. We can do in-person training as well. So we have either a short session or longer sessions up to full workshops to take your team through the level of detail that's needed. We also offer e-learning modules. So we have more general modules which cover specific topics, as well as very specific modules. So we have, for example, GDPR for investigators and site staff, to be able to dig in more detail about what specifically affects them. And as we said, most of our operational team has a background in life sciences. We've deliberately built these to address what we see as how you manage a trial and how a trial runs. We have a question, is this more like auditing? No, we don't really do auditing. We do gap analyses when we're working with a client. And that's to understand what's in place already, where there's potential risks, recommendations for how to address them. It really gives us an action log of high priority items to work through and try and address. But essentially that's more to bring you to be more compliant and less about auditing you. It's not sort of a tick box or a measure of compliance or anything like that. And we have, what about transfers to the US? So transfers to the US is an interesting topic actually at the moment. So at the moment, the US is a third country. Some of you may be aware that there were measures in place previously to allow the free flow of data to the US. They were invalidated a couple of years ago now, and they're currently working on new processes between the EU and US and UK and US to enable data transfers to flow again. As things currently stand, the US is a third country, and the transfer mechanisms I talked about before would be required. There's been an executive order in the last few days that hopes to move us towards a smoother flow of data. But let's see. I don't know at this point. As far as I'm concerned, at this point, we keep putting in place the protections just to be sure. But the US is a actively evolving and growing area, so who knows what's going to come in the next few weeks. Okay, great question, obviously, because I want to sell to you. Thank you very much. Can we procure these services as we need them? Of course you can. There's a contact email address on the screen at the moment, as well as our LinkedIn QR code and also our LinkedIn page. Feel free to contact us through any of those measures, and we will come back to you as soon as we can to understand your needs and to make a suggestion for how we can support you. In terms of how long you need the services, I would point out that storage of data is still processing of data. So it might be that you don't need a huge amount of input or support while you're storing or archiving a study. You should still consider, if you've got EU or UK data being archived, what do you need in place to protect it and to meet the GDPR requirements? For example, if you don't have an EU or UK presence, you may need to have an EU or UK data protection representative. But if you contact us, we can walk through where you are, what you have in place, and what we can do to support you moving forwards. Last question, I think I'm seeing some thank yous come up. So is the DPO really required for UK trials? Yes, they are for UK trials as things currently stand. So one of the UK government's proposals was to remove the requirement for a DPO. That's been shelved for the moment, but it's worth noting, in case it comes back, when they said they were going to remove the requirement for a DPO, if you read the small print, it still said you have to have someone senior that's experienced and understands the data protection requirements, which for all intents and purposes is a data protection officer. So yes, you still need a DPO as things currently stand for UK trials. Okay, I'm going to say thank you all very much. Thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure presenting today. Please do come back to us if you have any questions about what we presented or about how we may support you moving forward. Very happy to work with you. Otherwise, I wish you all a good day, and thank you very much for listening.